is Eva, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, a podcast for knitters who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. If you're a new viewer, I'm so glad you found your way to my little corner of the internet, and if you're a returning viewer, it's wonderful to see you again. Thistle is behind me, making her little guest star appearance. Moth was on the bed, but in the way of cats, decided that she should go exploring. If she jumps up later, I'll go ahead and pop out of frame again. It has been so snowy and wintry here. We had a giant winter storm last weekend, which was a long weekend in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here in the U.S., in case you're not American. And yeah, so the lighting is a little crazy. The sun is out today. It's not an overcast day, but as soon as the sun, there are some clouds in the sky, so it's probably going to vary between warm and cool. So sorry about that. I have been up to knitting since the last time I saw you, which was 2 weeks ago. My illnesses have been a little cranky, so I wasn't able to record last week, but I'm really glad to be sitting with you now, and I have 2 finished objects to talk about. The first is my Tea Party cardigan, which I finished and I'm wearing, and I will go ahead and button it up so that you can kind of see the full effect. So there's a lot that I love about this sweater. There we go. I love the color work and the little designs and the stripes, and I love the sleeves. I went ahead and knit extra long cuffs, and they're so cozy, but then when it warms up I can just push them all the way back so that they're a 3/4 length sleeve. Hang on, try to demonstrate that. Well, you get the idea. And I really love that. Yeah, so it's a really comfortable cardigan to wear, and I actually really love the way that it fits buttoned up. However, I do have a couple issues with it. But before I get into that, in case you haven't watched before, this is Quince Co yarn, and the mauve is Tern in Dusk. The yellow is Finch in Honey. Those are both fingering weight yarns. Tern just has silk in it, while Finch is 100% wool. And then the plum background is also Tern, but I dyed that myself. And actually, I should go ahead and answer a couple questions that I've gotten about dyeing now, because I keep forgetting. First of all, I can never tell you the exact proportions I've used for a color because I just kind of mad scientist it in the kitchen when I'm dyeing and just add things and adjust ratios, and I don't measure, so I'm sorry, I'm never going to be able to give you exact proportions. And then the other question was someone who's interested in trying to Kool-Aid dye but on cotton yarn. I don't think that works. There might be an additive that you can use, but the reason why Kool-Aid works as a yarn dye is because it has citric acid in it, which makes colors stick to protein fiber yarn. So that's going to be wool, silk, and I believe nylon as well, because nylon was manufactured to behave like wool. Alpaca. But yeah, I don't think you're going to be able to dye a plant yarn, which is a cellulose fiber, with Kool-Aid unless you add something to it. So sorry about that. If someone else knows more about that, feel free to correct me down in the comments. But that is the extent of my knowledge. I've never tried to dye plant fiber yarn because of that reason. Okay, so back to the sweater. I'm sure you can guess what my issues are with it. So this is a very wide neckline, and I did go back and shorten the arm side. I was sharing before that I just knit it like 1 stripe too long, and I don't know why either, because when I was looking at my drawing, I only had 5 stripes planned, so I don't know why I had added a 6th stripe. But the arm side is the perfect length now, so that's great. But I forgot that since I decided to bind off here, that was a little lower than my usual neckline bind off, so I should have done the neckband deeper, and I just forgot. So I did my usual neckband, and it's just a little lower than I would like. I like it to hit about here. And then also, I think the neckband, it got stretched out in the blocking, or I picked up too many stitches or something like that, because you can see how wide it is. And this is my shoulder, and this is the shoulder seam. So it's not actually falling off my shoulders, but it's coming very close, which annoys me. Usually, I would just rip it out and reknit it, especially since I have basically 50 grams of the dusk left over. I'm not running out of yarn anytime soon. However, there's a different problem, and that is that with each of these stripes, it created quite a few ends. And so rather than leave all those ends till the end, I wove them in as I went. So after I finished doing the neckband, I wove in the ends for these stripes and the stripes on the back. And so I'm afraid that if I take this neckband out, because I also trimmed the ends, I'm just going to lose those ends. I don't know. So that's why I haven't fixed it. I think I'm going to try just crocheting and seeing, because this is ribbing, it should tighten back up. If I just, crochet it. So if anyone has any tips for how to tighten up a neckband without redoing it, please let me know. I've always just ripped them out. And then the other issue, there are actually a couple. So as I said, I like how it fits when it's buttoned, but that's not how I wear most of my cardigans. I wear them with just the waistband buttoned and then the top unbuttoned so that it creates a nice little shape around the dress. And I knit this sweater with positive ease. In the past, I've only knit sweaters with either zero ease, which means I was knitting a garment the exact same measurements as my body, or negative ease, which means that the garment was slightly smaller than my body. And so this one I decided to go ahead and knit it with about an inch of positive ease. And while I like how that looks when it's buttoned up, I don't like how it's behaving when it's unbuttoned. So most of the sweaters, if you've watched the podcast before and you've seen me wear sweaters, they do this, which I think looks more intentional than this, which is what this sweater wants to do. This is nitpicking. I'm going to wear this sweater and I'm going to love it. I'm just letting you know. So I've learned for the future that while I definitely, I'm currently knitting a pullover and that will have positive ease in the bust area, but if I'm knitting a cardigan to just wear the way that I normally wear cardigans, I need to make it with 0 inches of ease, not with extra ease. The other issue, well, 2 more issues. I think the button band, I didn't pick up enough stitches. I think my rows were longer than my usual row gauge, so my usual button band made for a pretty short button band, so I had to really stretch it out when I was blocking it, and so that made it so that instead of being an inch wide, which is what it was when I knit it, now it's maybe 3/4 of an inch, so that's a little smaller. But once again, I can't go back and rip that out and fix it because I've woven in all the ends into the pickup, and I just don't know what effect that would have on those ends, and it makes me nervous to think about risking that. So what I think I'm going to do, because this has a bit of a tendency to floop, although not as bad as I blocked it, then I sewed the buttons on, then I wore it, and it was just flooping constantly, so I reblocked it before wearing it today, and now it seems to be behaving a little better. But these are in fact metal buttons, and I'm thinking about cutting them off and adding some lighter weight buttons instead. Okay, so those complaints aside, as I said, I really love this sweater. It is so cozy to wear, and I love the colors, and it's just really fun to finally have a multicolored sweater in my wardrobe. I would definitely knit more of these, just slightly different body measurements, and I really like how the sleeves fit. I think I am at a point where I pretty much know how much positive ease I want in my sleeves, so that's really nice. Oh, also, sorry, back to criticisms. The waistband of this sweater is just, it's not behaving itself at all. It's just bagging out. And since for me the whole point of cropped cardigans is to have a really snug waist because it looks best over the poofy skirts or fit and flare dresses that I like to wear, I don't know what's going on with that. I did knit this without seams, so I think I'm going to add a faux crochet seam, and then I really think I'm just going to match a seam and take in the waistband a little because it's weirdly loose. And I've done twisted rib waistbands in Quince Co before and not had that issue, so not sure what's going on there. I realized that sounded pretty negative, and honestly I wanted a comfortable casual cardigan, and so this doesn't bother me at all. I really like how it looks A-line buttoned as well. That's when I just button the top button and wear it over kind of an A-line top essentially. And I know that I'll wear this a lot. As I said, I really like how it looks when I just wear it as a top, completely buttoned up. So it's always a learning experience with sweaters. And I knew when I went into this planning to knit it a little bigger than my usual size that I was kind of hoarding. Not disaster, but, you know, just trying out new things. And yeah, I'm still really happy that I have it, and I have no plans to re-knit this. I know that with those criticisms it might sound like I was planning to rip it out, but those fitting issues aside, I plan to just wear this a lot and really love it. So all's well that ends well. And the exciting thing is I have a 50-gram about 50 grams left of the dusk, so I think I'm going to use that as the contrast color when I knit the other purple sweater quantity that I have in stash, which is Quince Co Damson in Finch. And I can knit that as a nice, snug, classic sweater. And that way I'll still have a purple sweater to wear with all my poofy skirts. And then this one can be more with my trousers or just my casual thing. It's so easy to layer over t-shirts. In the past I've talked about how I don't like wearing hand knit sweaters over t-shirts because I don't like how they stick to the knit fabric. It kind of creeps me out. But this has enough positive ease that the stickiness is less of a big deal, and I can just reach up and adjust the sleeves. So, and I definitely am now, you know, trying to plot what color combinations I would do and whether I would do more of these stripes. I adapted the Whitby stockings pattern for this, or do different kinds of color work, but I really like it, and I'm really happy that I have a striped sweater in my wardrobe. The other finished object is also for me, and these are my deep blue sea socks, also in Quince & Company. This is Quince & Company Finch in Peacoat, and I knit myself a pair of socks out of Finch and Peacoat last winter, and I loved them, but they got felted by Joel in his washing machine. He felt really bad. I think it was my fault. I threw them in the hamper. I didn't realize then that he doesn't sort his laundry, so I set that up. It's not on him. So I've been meaning to knit a replacement, and when I knit the first pair of socks, I started with 2 full skeins of yarn, and then I had also knit some striped socks with it, but I knew that I had enough left over, basically, to knit a pair of socks if I just bought another 50-gram skein. So that's what I did. And the dye lot does vary quite a bit. Luckily, it's a really dark color of yarn, so you don't see it unless you're looking for it, but this is the old dye lot, and this is the new one. The new one is much closer to black, and the old one has a lot more like blue indigo in it. It's sad, I actually prefer the older one, but that's okay. So rather than worry about striping or anything like that, all I did was make sure that I used the new one for both the legs. So, sorry, these are homemade sock blockers. So just in case anyone is staring that closely at my ankles when I'm wearing them with socks, they'll match up that way. And as I said, because the yarn is so dark, once you're at any kind of distance, it's really not that noticeable. So I used an Evelyn Clark sock pattern, whose name I can't remember right now. Go with the flow. There we go. And it's from the Interweave Favorite Socks book, which I borrowed from my library. And it's just a really nice, easy to memorize pattern. So it was a very rhythmic, enjoyable knit. And yeah, I pretty much followed the pattern as suggested, but then I went ahead and substituted a rounder toe. It's My Favorite Toe from a Knitty pattern that I've linked to a lot before. And I did make them anatomical toes, so I made it so that there's more fabric on the big toe side, so these are like right and left socks, and less fabric on the pinky toe side. And there we go. You can see that. So in order to do that, all I did was I followed the usual toe that I do now, but I always did the decreases as written on the pinky side, and I only did half the decreases on the big toe side. And that worked out really well. It means that I went down to far fewer stitches than I usually do. If I'm knitting a regular toe, I stop around 14 or 16 stitches and graft them together. But with the anatomical toe, I think I went down to maybe 7. That's what it looks like. And the reason why I did that was because one of the places where my socks need darning is under the big toe. And I have thought about doing reinforced toes, but I'm not sure how that would feel. Maybe it would feel nice because of the poofy fabric, but for this pair I decided to just go ahead and see if leaving more fabric in the big toe area would be enough to kind of help that out so that it's not getting stretched out and then worn as it's being stretched out. Because I never have any issues with darning anywhere in the toes except the big toe, so that's what makes me think it's like a stretchy issue. And yeah, so I wanted to go ahead and include a follow-up review of Quince Finch as a sock yarn today. I realized that I forgot to give you a little preview, so it'll be finished objects, works in progress, a knitting book review, and then the review of the Quince sock yarn. So I want to get into some details about that later, but I will say that the other reason why I didn't do anything extra to enforce these is because my gauge is much tighter with these socks than my other Finch socks. I'm actually getting 8 stitches to the inch, whereas I never used to be able to do that before. I was such a loose knitter that it just wouldn't happen, and I wasn't going to go below a size 0 needle because below size 0 I can only find them in metal needles, and those make my hands sore quickly, so kind of ruins the fun of sock knitting. So that's the other reason why I didn't want to do a lot of other changes with these socks, because I want to see how just the gauge affects wear. And I knit them with a fairly short leg, and that's so that they look nice with Oxfords when I wear them during the fall and spring. And hopefully I can still layer them over tights because they're really nice and stretchy, which is kind of my ideal sock. And yeah, just really happy to have a pair of navy socks again in my rotation because I wear a lot of navy. I'm wearing a navy dress today, so they will get a lot of use. This is my 3rd pair of navy socks, actually. As I said, the ones that I knit last year were felted. And then the pair before that, it was one of the very first socks that I knit, and I knit it out of a hand-dyed yarn by Lorna's Laces, and it just did not hold up at all. So those were just way too scruffy to wear, and they became scruffy pretty quickly, so that was disappointing. So hopefully the 3rd pair will destroy the curse of the navy socks. On to works in progress. So since I finished my tea party cardigan, obviously I had to start another sweater, and I have gone ahead and started the short sleeve pullover blouse type sweater that I wanted to knit next. This is out of hand-dyed yarn, and I just dropped one of the skeins, but I've got the other one, and it's from Twisted Threads, but she is no longer selling yarn. But yeah, so I actually did quite a bit of swatching because I'm not used to variegated yarn, and I found that any kind of small details, and especially anything that combined knits and purls, it just was getting lost. It just looked like yarn variegation. And I thought about doing lace because I think that this nice kind of loose 2-ply yarn, it's 100% organic merino in fingering weight. It looks really nice as lace, but I want to be able to wear this as a top on its own. I don't want to have to layer it over a camisole, and because it works so well with the lace, the yarn overs were very open. So none of the lace patterns I tried I would have felt comfortable wearing without a camisole underneath. So what I ended up going with were some cables. And this is just on the front panel. The rest is stockinette. So the border cables are just 4x4 cables, and I'm crossing them every 10 rounds, I guess, because it's in the round. And I've got them staggered. So on the 5th and 15th and 25th round, those go, and on the 10th and 20th and 30th round, that one goes. And they're all pointing inwards, so they're symmetrical on either side. And then the center cable is from a sock pattern called Paraphernalia, which is a free pattern, and it's a really nice ribbed cable. It's what I used to knit my first pair of navy socks, and I loved it. So when I was trying to think of a good center cable, because I so rarely knit pullover, so I don't get to do the centered panel thing very often, the ones that I was trying from my stitch pattern books, none of them were quite right. And then I remembered the Paraphernalia pattern because I had it in my queue, because I was planning to knit some socks for Joel with that. Anyway, so I went ahead and tried that out, and I really liked it. So I like how these nice big bold cables seem to kind of show off the variegation and work with it, and yeah, I just thought that it would work best. So I know that they're not very visible from far away, but that's okay because I know that they're there. And as you can see, I'm working it all in one piece in the round, and that's because I'm alternating the skeins to prevent pooling, and so it seems a lot less fiddly to just do that once every round. So you can see my little inner seam. But this sweater has taught me that I really like the structure of seamed garments, and luckily I was just watching an episode of Handmade in Woolen. I think that's it. Used to be Tiny Paper Foxes. And she mentioned that she had read a technique, I believe on Karen Templer's blog, where basically you can knit it all in one piece, but you put in side seam stitches, and then at the end you just match or seam it as if it were two pieces, and that makes sense to me, so that is my plan. So you can see I've got 2 extra stitches on each of the sides, and those will disappear. So that'll give me some seaming structure. I did a really deep waistband, and that's because I'm basing this pullover on my favorite pullover sweater that I thrifted quite a while ago, and I just love it. It has a nice deep welt as well. And so I think I knit 5 inches because that's what that one is. And I was a little worried that it wasn't going to fit over my shoulders because I have quite broad shoulders, but I tried it on and it's fine. So that was exciting. And then what I did for the body was I decided that I wanted it to be at 30 inches around. And so when I had done the swatching, I had measured about how much space these cables took unstretched, because I planned this to have positive ease the whole way, so it's not going to be stretched. So I took out that measurement, and then I think that was about 6 inches, I can't really remember. And then whatever was left, the 24 inches or whatever, then I multiplied that by my gauge, which is 7.5 stitches to the inch, and that gave me a total of how many stitches I needed to increase to, so I could plan my increases out that way. I also want to have more fabric in the front than the back because the point of the positive ease is so that it's not super clingy in the bust area, and so obviously my bust is on the front. And after that, I have gone ahead and added stitch markers. So on my increase rounds, I'm increasing 8 stitches, 2 at each side seam, and then 2 at basically the princess seams of the front and back, which is how I think I always do my bust increases, as long as the pattern allows for it. That's like my default. And yeah, so all of that seems to be working really well. I should probably stop and measure my gauge because I only did flat gauge swatches, and obviously this is in the round, so I'll probably stop soon and check. But because I want some positive ease in this, and if anything, I'm looser in the round than flat, I wasn't really that worried. If I've got more positive ease down, right after the waistband, and then I just do fewer increases to get to the bust measurement that I want, that's fine. So that's why I wasn't more precise about it. And I thought I would talk about how I'm tracking these cables. So as I said, the side ones are every 5th round, basically one of them goes. And then this cable, I'm following the paraphernalia chart, which is free, and it's essentially either every 4th or every 6th round. And I'm pretty good at reading my knitting. I don't usually have to use a lot of stitch markers, but cables I can find a little tricky. And when I'm knitting cables flat, I find it pretty easy to read, because then if I'm like, oh, I'm not sure if that's 3 or 4 rows, I can just look at whether I'm on the right side or the wrong side and go accordingly, because it's always like one that I'm not sure of, right? But in the round, obviously you can't do that because you're always looking at the right side. So I'm just using stitch markers to track. So every time I do one of these cables, I move up the little B stitch marker, and I'm putting it in a purl bump just because purl bumps are really easy to count. And then every time I do one of the main panel cables, I just have this little gold locking stitch marker, and that is tracking that, and it just really simplifies matters for me. And then I've also got 2 little plain silver ones that mark off the panel from all the plain stockinette, and these 2 which mark off the center panel because I know that that's when I need to start knitting 3, purling 1. Although I'm actually thinking about switching these out for the plain metal ones as well, because since I'm switching between knitting and purling, I keep accidentally flipping these off. I don't think they're the best for this, so I might, what I could do is right now I've got this cute little stitch marker as my side seam, but I've got 3 of these because they're a gift, so I could move the green one over here and then use these for the cable. I don't know. More stitch markers than usual, so I just thought I would explain them. And then finally, as I said, I've got my side seam one, and this is the beginning row one, the brass one, and then I've got this locking safety pin, and that's just tracking my bust increases. I guess it's called waist shaping, but since I'm going up, it seems more like bust shaping. And that's every 8th round that I'm doing that. And then on the back, I've just got 2 other little metal silver ones, which tell me where to increase. Which all sounds quite complicated, but it was easy to set up, and it makes it much more mindless, because other than that center cable pattern, it's just all stockinette. So other than the yarn management and remembering to switch yarn every round, there's not a lot to track, and I just find that having the extra stitch markers means I can glance and see whether I'm getting close to my increases or not. So this is a really fun, relaxing project. I have called it the Queen Mallow blouse, which is a reference to a character from Catherine Valenti's Fairyland series, which starts with the girl who circumnavigated Fairyland in A Ship of Her Own Making. She's a minor character, but I don't know, something about these kind of cotton candy colors, but in the best possible way, and also a little bit of like Victorian mourning colors. I don't know. It just made me think of Queen Malo, so that was my thought process behind that. And in case you didn't watch the last episode, this is going to be a short sleeve blouse, and I'm going to do the sleeve cuffs and then a Peter Pan collar in a contrast color. So I'm really looking forward to getting to that, and it seems to be growing pretty quickly. So it would be really fun if it turns out that short sleeve blouses work from a style perspective in my wardrobe, because then I'd be able to knit more sweaters in the round. My next work in progress will also be familiar from last episode when I was planning it, but I am knitting a snowy owl, and I have finished her head and her body and all that, and I've actually finished all the knitting. So I've got 2 wings, and believe it or not, these are 2 legs with claws. So I just need to sew the wings on and then assemble the legs, which is going to take, I think that's how the wings go? No, because this is the cast on edge. There we go. The wings are going to go like that, and then obviously the legs will be down here. And I actually have some wire that I bought when I was thinking about making masks, so I'm going to put some wire in the legs so that she's the best little owl she can be. And I'm using a pattern from Pebble Rain Dots. Can't remember if that's her Instagram account. She makes various animal patterns, and then she makes one available for free, I think every other month. So I got this when it was free. I could not resist it, and I thought it would make a really nice birthday gift for my niece, who is turning 13. And I did go ahead and use the glow-in-the-dark safety eyes that I had ordered from an Etsy seller, so they are more slit-pupiled, I think, than an owl would usually be. But they're so pretty, and they're the right color for a snowy owl, so I decided to just go with it. And they glow blue in the dark, which I think is a fun addition. And I am using 4 different yarns. The 3 main ones, there's a chunky, they're from Knit Picks. So there's this, which is Wonder Fluff, which I think is a brushed alpaca. Then there's their Kid Mohair Silk in white, and I'm frequently having to use 2 strands of that. And then the black, they were out of black in the silk mohair, so I just went ahead and got their black alpaca lace weight, so that's what the contrast is. And I think it's working pretty well. And then the other yarn that I needed was for the beak and then for the talons, and I'm just using some leftover black worsted weight yarn that I had. I think it's actually Swish, another Knit Picks. I think it's from the mittens that I made for Christmas. And I should have measured the yarn since I have finished the knitting. I was kind of worried about yardage. The pattern doesn't give you yardage specifics, and the main yarn that it calls for is not a very widely used one, so I was a little worried, but I have leftovers, although the wings tell you to hold the main yarn double, and I only held it single because I was worried I would run out of yarn. And I figured since you sew them on anyway, it doesn't really matter whether they're double the thickness or not. That's the only modification I made to the pattern. I don't know how I feel about this pattern. I think it makes for a really cute end result, and it's very cleverly done, but it's not really that enjoyable to knit. And I think that there's a lot of room for error. I would not recommend this as your first softie project, because like the face in particular, and she says in the pattern, she's like, you need to take your time with this, you know, you need to fiddle around with it a lot, but it definitely took a lot of fiddling. And yeah. And the other issue that I have is that all the spots where you carry the black, all it says in the pattern is to carry it randomly on knit rows and carry it behind when you're not working. So as far as I can tell from that, and that direction is given more than once, so it's not a typo. That means that on all the purl rows, I just had to strand it across in the back, which was really cumbersome. And then there's something just really exhausting about having to constantly decide how many stitches you're going to carry the black yarn for, that just caused brain fatigue in me. So I really had to space this out, even though, I mean, I knit this on a size 10 needle, so it shouldn't have taken that long. And as soon as I would get to the plain parts, those flew, or like the tail. Anything where I didn't have to do random carrying. But yeah, for some reason I just found that really mentally exhausting. So I don't know if I would knit this pattern again, but I absolutely love the finished results, and she is definitely worth the hassle this time around. I'm just so excited to get her fully assembled. My niece's birthday is February 5th, so I want to get her in the mail next week. So before I finish her, I will take some photos to show you on the next podcast. She probably won't be there. And as I said, other than the head, I think the directions are really well done in that she tells you what to do, and as long as you follow them, you're going to end up with a good result. But since faces are so important in animals, I don't know. That's tricky. And then there were a few points where I was just a little confused, and I was trying to zoom in on the pattern photo so that I could see what her owl looked like, but her owl only appears from certain angles, so that's okay. Obviously, I got it as a free pattern, so I don't feel like there's a lot of room to complain when a pattern is free, but if I had paid for it, I would probably feel a little frustrated. But, oh, look at this. She's so lovely. I love her so much, and I think that I think my niece is going to be delighted. So the end result was definitely worth it. I just don't think this is a beginner-friendly pattern for softies. That's what I'm trying to say, really. And I was just mentioning that weird brain fatigue about having to decide how much is random when carrying the black yarn. And I really don't know how else you could write that pattern for that section, because it does need to be random, right, to look more like a snowy owl. It was just weirdly exhausting and made me need to take a lot of breaks. But oh, look at her, I'm so excited. I think my niece will be really excited to have a head wig. Got one more work in progress, and this one you haven't heard about before. So it is another pair of socks for Joel, and I have finished the first one. This is out of Knit Picks Stroll Fingering in the pumpkin colorway, which is not nearly as bright in orange as is showing on the screen. But that's okay. And I have finished the first one, and I've just started the second one, so it's a little baby sock. And I'm calling these my pumpkin spice socks, not mine, Joel's, because first of all, obviously pumpkin, and also this pattern, it adds an interesting twist to what is actually a pretty basic sock pattern, so a little bit like the vanilla latte socks. and I really love the result, and I think it'll make for a really nice, comfortable sock for Joel. You can see it's got diagonals going this way for the leg and then the other way for the foot, and it continues all the way to the toe, and then there's also these cool little triangular segments on either side of the leg. And the pattern is from this book, which I got from my library, Silk Road Socks by Hunter Hammersen. This is the second edition, which she put out from her own printing press. Well, press. It's not a printing press, but she designs her own books now, and it's Pantsville Press. And this book was out of print for a long time, so I think it's cool that she redid it. And the pattern that I'm using is Kazakh, which I think it's interesting. I liked how it looked in this yarn, but I really love how it looks in the solid orange. And it kind of blends with the motif. So, as I mentioned, I want to be knitting a lot of socks this year. And my navy pair, I tried 3 different patterns, maybe 4 different patterns, so there was a lot of ripping and reknitting, and it appears that that is just going to be my theme for this year, because I had actually knit about this much with a different pattern for these socks before I realized that it was not going to work. And that was the Gordays pattern, which are these beautiful twisted stitches, and I had Joel go through the book, and this was his favorite. The other one was his second favorite. So I started with the Gordays socks, but it comes in a 72 stitch count pattern, and I thought that that would be okay, even with the twisted stitches, because Joel usually, his other socks are 68 stitches around the leg and then 64 stitches at the foot. But I was completely fooling myself. So I knit about that much, and then I tried it on, and it fit me really well, and I wear a women's like 6.5 to 7 shoe, and Joel wears a men's, I think, 10.5, 11. So then I went to have him try it on, and even just putting it on his foot, the self, not trying to get over the arch, it was already really stretched out and way too tight. And so we were both like, nope, that's not going over the arch. So then I ripped it back and started with this pattern instead. And I think that this is by far the better choice, because the other 2 pair of socks I've knit him have both been out of variegated yarn, and I wanted to make sure they were fitting well, so I just did a 3x1 rib for both of those. And so I think, since I'm still figuring out fit and all that, picking a stitch pattern that is nice and stretchy and has ribbing in it was really just a better transition. Shouldn't have jumped straight to twisted stitches, because they make fabric so snug. So it's kind of the opposite of what you want in socks. I just couldn't resist. They were so pretty, and Joel liked the pattern. I'm like, of course I'll knit you those. So maybe in boot socks those would work. Yeah. Although I mentioned that possibility to Joel, and he said, oh, well, if they're boot socks, I would want them long. So then I'd have to figure out how to do calf fitting. So we shall see how that goes. But yeah, so this pattern is wonderfully simple. I had it memorized really quickly, and it has just been a delight to work on. And I finished up this sock within just a few days, so I'm really looking forward to the second sock. I have only made a few modifications. First of all, I made the cuff longer because I know that Joel likes an 80 round leg, and this chart was only 60 rounds, so I needed a 20 round cuff. I also did the cuff on 68 stitches. The pattern is written in 8 stitch increments. It's for 56, 64, and 72. So I did go up to 72 for the leg, so I figured it was better to err on that than 64. But because I know that Joel likes snug socks, I just did the cuff on 68 and then increased. And to maintain the pattern, I increased only in the stockinette section. So I just did 4 increases here. And let's see, the heel flap, I changed it a little bit. It's written to just be 2x1 ribbing, and I did that on the wrong side rows, but on the right side rows I slipped the knits so that there would be a little bit of slip stitch protection in there. And then I changed the gusset decreases because, as I mentioned, Joel likes to have a 64 stitch count on his foot, and since he likes really snug socks, I thought that, especially since this was 72 to begin with, and then of course you're doing gusset pickups, so I thought he might like it if the gusset kind of decreased more quickly. So a standard gusset decrease is you decrease every other round, and so I decreased 2 rounds in a row, and then I did a rest round. So so this is how long the gusset is, and I will see what he thinks when he tries them on, and whether he likes that or not. And then the toe, I followed the pattern as the book suggests, but instead of doing her decrease rate, I did my favorite toe decrease rate, which I referenced so many times, I feel like I should just include a link to it on my YouTube page or something. But that is from a Knitty article. And I did not make it anatomical. I didn't make more space on one side than the other. It's just a plain sock. So they'll be interchangeable. And that is my last work in progress, and it's very enjoyable. It was my knitting while we were doing our role-playing game on Wednesdays, so I think that'll probably be, Wednesdays will be my main sock knitting, and then the weekends as well, because I spend those at Joel's and it's easier to pack socks than other things. I am now rambling, so those are all of the knitting projects that I have to show you this week. So now I'm going to do a quick review of the book and also talk about Quince Finch as a sock yarn, which I did, I think, a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, but time has passed since then. Okay, so Silk Road Socks by Hunter Hammersen. It's an absolutely beautiful book. The textures are really nice. The photos are all in color. And in addition to the photos of the socks, there's illustrations of the inspiration from the silk rugs. And of course, each sock is photographed on silk rugs. And I read at the end that they're all photographed in her home, which just puts me in awe of her rug collection. A little bit envious there. The socks are a really nice mix of, I guess, complicated patterns primarily. The one that I'm knitting for Joel, the Kazakh, that is by far the simplest. Most of them are more ornate. But, so there's some cable ones. You saw there's several twisted stitch style cable ones, like the one that I knit. And then there's also some really nice lace ones. I will show you some of those. Let's see. This one I definitely want to knit, Sarab. And then I'm weirdly drawn to this one. So I was showing this to my friend Kristen, who's a new knitter, and she's like, oh, those are so impractical. And I'm like, true, but what if I wore them over tights? Because then it wouldn't matter that they were that lacy, and I think those cuffs are really fun. So I don't know, I think those might be cool tight socks. And so and then there's one other lacy one in there that's very open. But other than that, the other lacy ones I think are quite wearable. And then there's also texture ones. Oh, I think I already showed you these. You can always go see the collection on Ravelry, so I don't know why I'm showing them all to you, except they're all so pretty. And there's also this really interesting introduction. There's a map and different illustrations, as well as history about rugs in the introduction, and then each of the sock patterns includes an explanation of the rug that was the inspiration. So as just like a physical object, this is an absolutely lovely book, and honestly, flipping through the socks, I think there are 20 patterns, and I would knit maybe all but 2 of them. Okay, there's 16 patterns, and I would knit all but 2 of them. So even though I got this from the library, I think it would be a good deal to buy the book as well. I think it retails for $27, and if you buy it, you get a code to get a copy of the digital one as well, which I think is really nice. So Hunter Hammersen, if you haven't knit any of her patterns, she is big on charts. So everything is charted. If you don't like knitting from charts, you should not get this book. Even the cuffs are charted and the heel flap. And not only that, but I think sometimes the charts make it a little more complicated, like the heel flap. I'm not sure why the heel flap was charted. And I was a little confused about whether I was supposed to be slipping the first stitch or the last stitch. And that doesn't really matter in the wider context. And if you've knit any pairs of socks before, then you're going to know the basic rhythm of how they should go. So then it's not going to feel that complicated to you. But if you've never knit socks before, I don't think this would be a good beginning, like absolute beginner's book. I think it would be a really fun way to push yourself to do more complex, interesting socks. And if anyone is interested in knitting through this with me over the next year or two, then let me know and maybe we can do that. Although I'm sure she's got her own group where they're knitting through the socks. I really enjoy that her patterns are kind of conversational. They all come in multiple sizes, both stitch count wise, and she has suggestions for different yarn weights and gauges. So that's really nice, although it does mean that she doesn't give you specific quantities of yarn. I don't think that's a big deal with most socks because I just assume socks are going to take 100 grams. Less than that, but and I've never run into any problems with that, but I don't think she writes patterns exactly the way that a lot of designers do write patterns, so there's a little bit of quirk going on there that might surprise you if you're completely new to her designs. But I think this is an absolutely wonderful book, and even though my library has it, I'm certainly thinking about getting a copy for my own shelves. And I want to knit so many of the socks in it, and because there's included quite a variety of stitch counts, I can actually do that. The sock that I started knitting for Joel and ended up ripping out, as I said, it was a 72 stitch sock, but it fit me really well, so I'm like, maybe I just need to knit myself a pair of those socks instead. So yeah, that was a brief review of this very lovely pattern book, and there's a nice pile. I guess that's on the cover too, and then the back cover is just all the different yarn that she used. Oh, so pretty. And if you enjoy kind of her blog and her aesthetic and that kind of stuff, then her books, I've seen I think 3 of her books now, and they all definitely live up to that. So I don't think you'll be disappointed by ordering this book. Oh, I'm looking at the very open lacy socks again and just imagining wearing these over tights. I think I might have to knit some of those. Let's see. That's Ardabil. What stitch count is it? Ooh, it comes in 4 stitch count options, so that would be nice. So yeah, would recommend this book if you're looking for interesting socks that have a variety of cuffs as well as bodies and feel very cohesive and a little bit of a challenge, but a good challenge. And we'll give you a variety of cables and lace and texture. So even if you were to knit through the whole book, you don't feel like you're just knitting the same sock over and over. So I was definitely impressed by it. I suppose we should just continue the sock theme for this episode, since I'm going to be talking about Quince Co Finch, their 100% wool fingering weight yarn in the context of socks. And I suppose since I'm knitting so many socks this year, it makes sense that several episodes will be sock themed, but I promise I'll be talking about sweaters and other things too. Oh, and I meant to let you know, thank you so much for everyone who has suggested topics and questions. I'm making them into a list so that I can review that list and pick topics before I record videos. I didn't have the time to do a separate topic today because I knew I wanted to get into a few things about this. But feel free to leave any topic suggestions on any video, and I just add them to my list. So if there's something you'd like to hear, maybe I haven't covered everything about socks yet, I don't know, please just go ahead and let me know. Okay, so Quince Co Finch it's a 4-ply, tightly spun, very bouncy fingering weight yarn. It has 220 yards to 50 grams, which is a pretty standard fingering weight. However, in my experience, it's a very plump fingering weight yarn, and I think that's why I had gauge issues before. Not issues, but why I couldn't get an 8-stitch to the inch gauge on size 0 needles, even though that's what I used to get with most sock yarns. And it is 100% American wool, and it's not superwash treated, and there's no nylon in it, which makes it a less processed choice for socks, which I really like, and especially since it's been tightly spun, that increases its durability. So all of my Quince Co Finch socks are the socks that I wear the most. I find them the most comfortable. I find them warmer than my other socks. I think it's because the fabric is slightly thicker, and since my feet tend to be on the cold side, I really appreciate that. And I just find them extra cozy. They never itch my ankles. Basically, my socks out of Finch and then Barocco Ultra Alpaca Fine are the only socks that I actually wear of the socks that I've knit. However, all of my Finch socks at this point have needed darning at least once. So this pair was the most recent darning one that I did last night. So this sprung an actual hole while I was walking, and noticed that it's under the big toe. So that one is messy, and then when I looked at the other one, it hadn't sprung a hole yet, but it was on its way, so I just went ahead and enforced that fabric. And I just use whatever fingering weight yarn I have laying around, since, it's the bottom of my foot. It doesn't really matter to me whether the mending is visible or not. Although I will say that I definitely need to work on my darning skills. And not only have all of them needed at least some darning, well, almost all of them. This pair hasn't. But let's see. Maybe my foxes haven't either. Yeah, only one of them needed. Okay. Those are the foxes. But as I was saying, my owlie socks, these are one of my most worn pair of socks. I darned them earlier, and then one of them sprung a hole in the heel, so I had to redarn it last night as well. And so I went ahead and checked the other sock for weaknesses, because I'm trying to get in the habit of doing that now, and reinforced, because over here it was looking a little thin too. But yeah. So I think that there are a few reasons why my Finch socks have needed darning and my other socks haven't. And I don't think that they're necessarily a reflection of the yarn. So first of all, as I said, I wear my Finch socks a lot. They are my favorites, and they tend to go with most of my outfits, and so they get a lot more wear than everything except my Ultra Alpaca Fine socks. So I don't think it's fair to do a comparison between my Finch socks and then a pair that I've knit out of, I have one Regia pair, and I never wear them because they itch me. So that's not a fair comparison, but I also wear my Ultra Alpaca Fine socks frequently, and those have not sprung holes in them, and I wear them just as often. So while that is a factor, I don't think that it's the only factor, since I have these other socks that I'm wearing a lot that haven't sprung holes in them. And Ultra Alpaca Fine is a more traditional sock yarn. It's got nylon in it, and so it's nylon, alpaca, and wool. And it doesn't actually say whether it's superwash wool or not. I just assume it is, but I don't know for sure. And I wash all of my socks the same way. I machine wash all of them in cold only, and then I put them all to dry. I hang them over a hanger, so I just fold them over and leave them to air dry. So that's how I launder all my socks. I don't launder them after every wearing. My feet don't really sweat because they're cold all the time. So I launder them maybe once a month. So that's probably every 4 wearings or so. Yeah, because I don't know. Anyway, just explaining, because your mileage might vary. And I have noticed that the socks seem to almost do better in top-loading machines than front-loading machines, which surprises me because the top-loading machines have an agitator, so I don't know why that is. But this pair I brought home with me for Christmas once, and I washed them in my mom's front loader, and they definitely got a little bit felty, whereas this pair, which I've only washed in my top loader, haven't gotten felty at all. But I probably put it on the wrong cycle. I probably put it on a cycle that changed the water temperature somehow. So that's going to be when you're going to have problems. And they didn't, luckily, because I love these socks, they didn't felt enough that they're unwearable. They're just a little felty compared to how they used to be. Here's the difference. So that can happen. And as I said, this pair hasn't sprung any holes in them, and I wear this pair frequently as well. So, although, ooh, that heel is looking, gonna have to reinforce that heel soon. I need to just get into the habit of reviewing socks, so there's kind of a thin patch being worn there. So another factor in why my Finch socks might be springing holes that isn't yarn related is gauge, as I mentioned. So this new pair of socks, I actually got a nice firm sock appropriate gauge, whereas some of my other pairs, I think it was this pair I measured, and this is slightly less than 7 stitches to the inch, so it's 6 something stitches to the inch. So that fabric is just inherently much more loose and vulnerable than this, which is very tight and snug, so I don't know if you can see that, but, and all of my Ultra Alpaca Fine socks, that's a very thin sock yarn, and so I have always had a pretty tight gauge on those. Like the fabric always feels pretty firm and snug. So that might be another reason why my Finch socks have sprung holes. And then the final reason that I was thinking about is it might be that for a while I was knitting my socks quite snugly, and that was because I don't hate, that's a strong word. I really dislike if I'm wearing a sock and then I put my shoes on and the sock rides up at the back. Oh, that's so annoying. And so I read somewhere that if that happens to you, that means that the foot of your sock is too long. So you should start knitting the foot part a little shorter. So that's what I did, and that does work. My socks don't ride up in the back, but I think that that also stretches it out around the big toe area and makes it more vulnerable there. So, and that's something that I read after I decided that Finch was going to be my primary sock yarn. So all of the socks that I've knit with shorter feet have been out of Finch yarn, because I think it's been almost my exclusive sock yarn for a couple of years now. And all of these socks have been worn quite a bit before they've had any holes sprung in them. Like, these are not new socks by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't have a problem with the fact that I need to darn them now. I should have reviewed my thoughts beforehand. Sorry that I'm being very uncohesive. I have to start. As I was saying, in a very disjointed and stumbling manner, I don't mind that my Finch socks are requiring darning. I think that the amount of wear that I get from them and how comfortable they are and how warm and cozy they keep my feet, as well as how fun it is to knit them because the yarn is just so bouncy and enjoyable to have between my fingers, I think that it's a small price to pay to have to darn them after, you know, a year, sometimes 2 or 3 years of wear. That's okay with me. And what I like is that even with the looser gauge and all these issues that have perhaps made the sock less strong, the areas that I haven't needed to darn are still really sturdy. Like, these socks are not on their last legs by any means. So even if there were a couple thin parts, since the rest of the sock is perfectly fine, that's really what I'm looking for, because even if darning takes, I don't know, I think I darned 6 socks in an hour or something last night. I had a pile built up. That's so much faster than knitting a pair of socks, and it's also a lot cheaper, because when I started knitting, Finch was $7.50 a skein. Now I think it's $9 a skein, which I'm making that face because I don't remember for sure, but I think it's around there, which I completely understand because that was quite a few years ago and cost of living has gone up. They've got employees. Maybe the cost of production has gone up. You know, I don't think that's an unreasonable jump, but that does mean that if I want 100 grams, then these are now $18 socks instead of $15 socks. And so I want them to last. And so if the entire fabric was falling apart, that would be a big deal. But darning a couple holes versus buying another $18 worth of yarn to knit a new pair of socks, you know, darning holes is essentially free for me because I've got leftovers that I'm using to darn. So, and there's also I like that There's fewer environmental ramifications when I'm using Finch because it's a less processed wool and it comes from my country, so there's fewer distance miles, although the US is a really big country, so I'm sure that this Quince Company is based in the Northeast, and their mill is also based in the Northeast, but I'm sure that the sheep are based somewhere in the West, since that's where most of the big sheep herds are. Sheep flocks, not herds. The big sheep flocks are. So I'm sure that there's still, like this is not a super local yarn, but it's definitely more local than any of the big brands, right? For me, living in Western New York, like it's bigger, or it's more local than Barocco or Cascade or any of the European yarns would be. And what I love is that this yarn is durable enough for socks, right? But it never itches me. And my skin is on the more sensitive side, so my ankles can get itchy with some yarns. And also, it works really nicely as a sweater yarn as well. And so, yeah, if it's durable enough for socks that just require a bit of mending every year or two, I'm okay with that. And I think I just need to get into a habit of checking the soles of my socks, because darning is so much easier if you notice that the fabric is thin and reinforce it then, versus wearing them all day, coming home and realizing that you have a hole that big. It's just easier to deal with it before it becomes that big of a problem. So I think that that's just something that I'm going to incorporate into kind of the rhythm of my chores. Maybe when I do a sock washing day, then I will just look at the socks as I hang them up. And the issue, I think, is that you can't just look at it this way. You have to, put your hand inside and kind of hold it up and see if there are any thin spots, because otherwise the fabric's doubled. But the other thing that I love about my Finch socks is that they don't sag. And that's my ultra alpaca fine socks will definitely get baggier and need to be washed more frequently, just from a sizing perspective. But even the plain stockinette sock, it stays up all day. It doesn't have a problem stretching to get over my arch, but then smooshing back to my leg. And it just, they make really well behaved socks. And Finch will continue to be my favorite sock yarn and my sock yarn of choice. But I did want to update you all that they are requiring darning now. And your mileage might vary depending on what gauge you knit it at and what kind of sizing choices you're making. But I thought that I would let you know that, because when I did my last review, none of the socks had any thin points or had required darning or anything like that. So my apologies for the rambling. So the gist of my review for Finch from Quince Company is that it is still my favorite sock yarn. I think it makes wonderful socks, whether I'm doing a cable pattern or a lace pattern or just a texture pattern. I think that the yarn shines equally well in all of those. Because it's a tightly spun 4-ply yarn, when I'm doing a lace pattern, the yarn overs aren't as big as they would be with a loosely spun 2-ply yarn, and I think that's actually nice for socks because it means that I can add a little bit of lace and it looks really pretty and it looks like an interesting texture, but it's not going to let in as much cold air as bigger yarn overs would. So I just think that this yarn makes beautiful socks no matter what type you want to make, and I would highly recommend it. But I just wanted to update you all that after another year and a half, however long it's been, the socks are starting to show a little bit of wear. And I will let you know how my new navy socks do with a much more extreme asymmetrical toe, and whether that kind of alleviates some of these issues. The other thing I want to start doing, which I did for a while and then forgot, is to make sure that I continue the slip stitch reinforcing down on the bottom of the heel, since, as you saw with some of those socks, that's the other place I spring hold. It's either here or here. Thank you so much for watching and bearing with me. I apologize for the rambling today, but at least it was mainly sock oriented, and then, a little bit about the Tea Party cardigan here. If I back up, you can see some more of the stripes. It's been really wonderful spending time with you, and I hope to see you again very soon. Going to move again so that you can see Moth and Thistle, who are both pretty much asleep on the bed. Thistle, hey, how are you looking? There's Thistle. She's excited to see you all, and Moth is behind her on the heating pad, so you can just see her little cream face sticking up. So from me as well, goodbye and happy knitting until I see you again.